Welcome to the Sense Kaleidoscopes podcast. And I think we are here because we are trying to change the narrative around autism, Vahini.
Yeah, and ensure that there's more awareness on with autism and everything that surrounds the spectrum and its world.
Yeah, because we know that with autism, there is a lot of associations
Mm-hmm.
and mostly negative. While we are going to try and tread carefully in this space, I think it's really important to have those positive narratives also out there.
Sure.
In my mind, this is exactly why we are here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, to begin with, let's set the context by explaining what Sense Kaleidoscopes is all about. Sense is the organization that I founded, and it started about a
12 years
decade,
ago.
10, 12 years ago, with an intention of supporting people with autism to either pursue the arts in a professional manner. And today we are also running a school which has a backstory to itself, which I think we will unravel through these series. And I am Akshay, the founder, and you are Vahini, who also supports me in this mission.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Sense is the first art college in this country for people with autism, as we both know. And we set it up primarily with the intention of creating a space that would train them professionally. We know that autism does not have a space to go and access that kind of education, create that kind of quality. And the intention of Sense was primarily to offer that.
I would also like to add that it's a vocational training center, and the arts was something that you were familiar with as an artist and with your training in art. That your exposure outside of this country uh, made you more aware of how individuals on the autism spectrum were reaching their full potential by with art as a means um, to kind of find a vocation, lead an independent life, so on and so forth. Yeah, am I right to say that?
Yes, we are definitely doing much more than therapy because I know that in India, when you say arts based programs, it's associated with therapy.
Correct.
And we have been very, very open about the fact and vocal about the fact that we are not therapy. While I believe very strongly that
It
art,
could also be.
it's a byproduct, isn't it? It's like when you're very stressed and you go to the doctor and then he says, okay, take a vacation, travel, because travel by itself does not become therapy. The process of traveling and what you experience becomes therapeutic. So, in my mind, just the process of making art is therapeutic. So, that is a byproduct and it's going to happen anyways. What we really wanted to focus in on was creating quality artists, creating artworks that people would look at and go like, wow, and people would start viewing autism through a very different lens because of those artworks, because of that effort. So yeah, I think that's what we do at Sense.
I think when we are talking about art as a focus, maybe you can tell the listeners slash viewers about yourself in terms of how this journey started for you, and it'll give them a more wholesome idea as to how this whole thing came to life and where it's going.
And when I always think about this, and I think we both have spoken about this multiple times as to how I came into this space, I was so confused as a young adult, not very sure about where I was headed, which is very different from how most of my friends have experienced life. And my mom wanted to pursue the arts and couldn't do it. So I didn't know what to do with my life. And so my mom said, why don't you just go and join Chitrakala Parishad, which is what I did. I graduated from there eventually and started to work in a website company, which was started by this guy who came back from the US, and there was a boom and so on and so forth in Bangalore at that point in time. Being in the corporate space didn't really do much for my soul, let's put it that way. And through a common friend, called Poonam, who you also know, I started volunteering in Spastics. That's where I think we both met as well.
Correct.
And that journey then realized towards a certain path that I think I had never thought of. While volunteering and meeting these children with autism, I think something shifted inside me. And I wanted to go and work in that space, but I had no idea how. The volunteering process in Bangalore took me from Spastics to Sunshine. I then applied for a scholarship, got a full scholarship to go to Scotland. Did a program over there, which was very interesting because it was bringing professionals who had graduated in a certain specific area but wanted to move into education.
Nice.
And I think that changed everything for me. I finished that program. I worked with the Glasgow City Council for almost a decade before I kind of came back to Bangalore. And sense was obvious, isn't it? I'd worked in the space of art. I had garnered so much experience working in that part of the world. It just made sense to kind of come back and put that on the offer over here. So that's how it all came to be. So I remember pursuing you for a very, very long time when I came back. I remember getting in touch with Poonam, checking in on where you were. And I do know a little bit about Bhavishya as well, because I know when I was leaving the country, you were starting it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about where you have been and what your relationship with Sense is?
I started out as a media professional, worked with Now Disney, Times of India, with the IPL, with a whole bunch of media organizations, selling sponsorships, selling ad time, doing ad sales predominantly. I think very early on, I got quite bored. I just felt that there was more to, me than just sales, media sales. And I took a break, and my mom asked me whether I would be interested in education. And I just said, yeah. And I just chanced upon the RCI autism course, which was happening at that time. I think it was in that second year of its
was
thing,
it?
of its introduction. So I did it with the RCI, and autism just happened, and I loved it, and I stuck. Started Bhavishya to raise awareness, to get more children diagnosed at an earlier stage, at various pediatric clinics, in hospitals, so on and so forth. Didn't meet with much success back then. So it was a slow process. But I continued working with media because it paid the bills. Yes, special education does not pay very well. So yeah, continued working with media, continued. I started another organization called Audio Academy. And amidst all this, I still also in parallel worked with people on the autism spectrum, whether it was with Sunshine Autism Trust, whether it was with the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, designing curriculum for the adolescents over there in Canada, whether it was working with Fourth Wave Foundation and reaching out to government school teachers as to how they can help people on the autism spectrum at the grassroots levels in various remote villages. So it's been a whole gamut of things, but I think I found home in Sense Kaleidoscope. I think it was interesting to work with young adults, teenagers, because I always felt that there was a void in that space, and you were not so bad. So I think that's how we started working together. Of course, we both think very differently. We have very opposing views, but I think that we also respect each other's work,
Yes.
and I think this is a good idea to have more minds. You also advocate community and having various schools of thought and everything on the table and us growing together. So I think that kind of resonated with me, and I hope that this same thought process resonates with everybody who's listening.
When I was thinking of starting Sense Kaleidoscopes, before that I had visited a lot of spaces. Some of them were the ones that we both have actually worked in our earlier times. And I realized that there was no space really that was working in a certain flow with young adults at that point in time. I still very strongly kind of sense that there is a void here.
Sure.
And I remember when I was thinking about starting Sense Kaleidoscopes, the first thing that came to my mind was behaviors. How are we going to make this happen? We know that young adults come with a gamut of behaviors. We know that there are no direct answers in this space. And that's why I was pursuing you. Can you tell me a little bit about how that kind of moved in your space? Because I remember you walking in, there was just four walls, there was really nothing. You didn't know what I was trying to do. I think you were just being an observer, giving me my time, my space to kind of figure my land out. But what were you going through?
So I started working with young adults because of my association with this one individual who had been handed down to me by Indrani and Poonam. Indrani is a working professional who works with the Action for Autism conclave. She runs the parent-teacher program there. Poonam is also a special educator who works with autism, but currently also does a bit of Montessori. And
Moved
she
into
works
the
with neurotypicals
consultancy
also.
space.
Yeah, but
Yes.
she moved more into the consulting space. So I found a lot of. I had a student who had a lot of comorbidity. I still continue to work with him, and combined with visual impairment because he had brittle sugars. He still continues to have all of it. So the behaviors are very different thing, and I have always realized that the key to anything is to observing, then bonding, and then letting the child direct you to come up with a strategy, and using common sense predominantly. So that's just my way of functioning. I don't think, of course, I do subscribe to a whole many schools of thought. However, I think the eclectic approach works best for me based on the individual and at that point in time. I don't think that there's only one school of thought that has worked continuously. With younger children, there's a certain school of thought that works with middle, like at least teenagers and young adults. With older individuals, there are different things that work. And I'm saying because it's a spectrum disorder, what works for one won't work for the other. But yeah, so when I saw you, I was just observing through my process of functioning. I just observed how you went about your environment, and then from that, whatever cues I could get, and then start my work from there on. So while I've been an advocate of this eclectic approach, uh, have you also been on? I mean, do you also think on similar lines, or do you think that there is one thing, one particular process that works for you and has worked for you time and time again?
So we both know that we have very, very different processes. I think what was really interesting for me was to watch how you were working because it's so different from my process. I'm very structured. I note take every small detail and then I kind of use that data, try and analyze it. I'm very interested in how science can come and play a part. Everything needs to be analyzed, everything needs to anchor to a particular proved scientific idea. And that's how I have functioned for many years. But having said that, I think working with you was really an eye opener. I also subscribe to multiple schools of thought because I'm very scared of this anchoring to one particular perspective. I think it narrows us out, especially when you're working in a space where you're dealing with human beings. So while I understand that aspect, for me, walking in the way you would walk into a space and then start working in this very organic manner doesn't come easy.
I trust my intuition. Yeah.
Correct.
So that's I possibly work more intuitively than anything else.
But that's a gift. That's a gift.
If you say so.
Because if you're able to walk in and do things so organically and also make it meaningful and impactful, that's a huge that speaks volumes about that process. Unfortunately, there are not too many people who understand that process. I think one of the things with this podcast that we are going to try and do is try and unravel that with you, because I really think that there is a lot of significance. But because, like you've said, many times I've tried to work with you where I've tried to kind of use your processes and try and map it in my structured
There will be no map.
tables and all of that, and it hasn't worked. But what I can say very effectively is just having you in this space and me and my team watching you, understanding what you were doing. When we didn't understand, you were very open to share with us what was going through you when you were doing those things, has really helped us today define the philosophy in SK of how we manage these environments, how we have ensured that the autistic young adults or teenagers in this space who come with so many complications can feel so much at home. So I think that's your approach, me trying to take that approach and fit it in some way or form so that it becomes more expandable and accessible to more individuals, because I think that's very key. And that's, I guess, what our relationship has been in the past few years and moving. Okay, well, let's start with defining autism. I know that there are multiple definitions and people can go and see whatever they need to see, but that's not how I want you to do it. I want you to make this really accessible to the layman. I want you to speak in a language that gets understood by everybody in the rural space, in the urban space. I mean, whoever is listening to us should be able to connect with it. So, can we start with the definition of autism? Also, if you can break down the spectrum disorder.
So I think I'll start by taking off from child development. I think it's easier to understand if I take that journey. So basically, when a child is born, the parent interacts with the child by getting the child to respond. It can be response to objects, can be response to sounds. Apart from the mother, I think the whole, the sensorial, the skin to skin, XYZ. But apart from that, responding to the environment is by pointing, right? You look at the child is lying on the bed and then you show the fan and say, hey, look at the fan or look at the light. And then the next time when the mother says fan, child has learned that word associated with a pointing and then looks up and you say, see, the child knows fan now. Right? Now, what happens if the child does not look? Right? So, the inability to possibly make eye contact or not seeing, we all learn through observation. From observation, we move on to imitation. Right? So, if the first step itself is not there, then you can say that the child is not attending, and because child is not attending, child is not learning. Because child is not learning, is unable to navigate his or her environment the way any other neurotypical child develops. Let me just say that. I'm just trying to be...
We have a gap there.
Sorry?
We have a gap there.
Right.
Because there is a very clear distinction in how a neurotypical child is achieving those developmental goals.
Milestones, correct.
The milestones, whereas we don't see that with the neurodivergent children.
Yes, you can say that. So, given that I've given you like a very baseline definition, not definition, an understanding of somebody who's possibly looking out for signs, whether the child is attending to something, the child is pointing, the child is understanding. So when we're talking about developmental milestones in children, these milestones are defined for neurotypical development. Okay. Can we get into like some sort of a vague definition, or at least an not vague, but understandable definition of what is neurotypical and what is neurodivergent? Anything that is not neurotypical is neurodivergent, basically.
Correct.
Right? By the clear like word itself, right? So can we talk about that a little bit? Like, what is neurotypical?
I'll help with the science behind it. Essentially, we do know that there are certain milestones that have been patched to a certain age.
Correct.
And that is the expectation that a child should be able to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 within this window period and within this age.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if a child delays on those milestones, whether it is crawling, sitting, speaking, looking, pointing, like you mentioned, if there is a delay in those milestones, clearly, scientifically, the child is not neurotypical, hence neurodivergent.
Okay.
So that's very simply how I would put it. So taking from what you were explaining about autism, while you very clearly stated a very nice example about how the imitation and the learning and so on and so forth is expected in an environment and how it happens in a neurotypical child. Can you take this further? Because we are aware that there are layers to this particular mind. If a child is not able to look when the mother is pointing, there are various reasons for it.
Sure.
Can we speak a little bit about that?
So the reason is the child is impaired in, say, social interaction. Means when you say good morning, hi, how are you to me, I will turn around and say, hi, good morning, how are you? I will not talk about the people who don't say good morning, hi, how are you? For reasons of, because they don't like me. But yeah, generally that's the norm, right? So if the child is unable to interact because the child doesn't know any better, right? And not just doesn't know any better because of various hurdles. One of them could be a sensorial issue, right? Where the child is, all the 5 senses are either hyper or hyposensitive. Hyper, as the English meaning goes, is overtly sensitive. And hypo is not sensitive enough. So that to maintain that balance.
Can you give us examples?
Child can hear too much, can hear much louder, and hence when you say hi or have a conversation, it's too much of a sensory overload or an auditory overload, will shut his ears and run away. Vis-a-vis a person who cannot feel, the tactile sensitivity is not as strong, and hence will keep bumping into things to kind of start feeling their own body, or whatever.
That's
any kind of thing.
hyposensitive.
That's hyposensitivity, yeah.
Okay. If we have to go further into the science, what is essentially happening in the nervous system? What's happening in the brain?
The brain is wired differently. Imagine if if you and I landed on Mars, and I quote this very often, but imagine if you and I landed in Mars and the weather was very different, and I'm extremely irritable, I am extremely frustrated, and I'm not happy being where I am because it's not my happy space, not something I'm used to. I don't understand what's going on. I want a glass of water. And I say, can I have some water, to the Martian that I meet? And Martian doesn't understand what water is. So I say, water? And then the Martian still doesn't understand the water. And I go through the well story and say, water. And I try various things. And then I say water, and I say Niru, and I say Jalam, and say all kinds of languages, and Pani, and I don't know what it is in Swahili, but maybe that was as well. But they just don't get it. So I'm like, okay, I don't want water. I will manage. And then I manage, and I manage, and I manage, and I'm still thirsty. And I still want water. So then I go to the next person and then I try. And there are only two Martians, okay, right now in this story. And I try the same technique and try different techniques. And it doesn't happen. So then I start screaming. And I start screaming and shouting and saying, like, can you give me water? And then I have an ultimate breakdown and I start throwing things and throwing stones because I don't know what else is available on Mars. I'll need to check with Elon Musk on that. But yeah, like that's the story, right? So what I'm trying to say is it's not only an impairment of interaction because of interaction, communication, because I don't observe, I don't know how to communicate, I don't understand the language, and it's classified by these behaviors. So the behavior was sensory because I was feeling different when I was in this new place. A behavior was because I was unable to communicate and get my ideas across. The Martian tried to speak to me, but I wasn't able to understand what they were saying. So all these together will result in how I behave on Mars rather. And that's how possibly a person on the autism spectrum would feel if they were to exist.
Yes, yes. I think that's a very beautiful example. And very interestingly, you covered the environmental disconnect as well
Right.
by setting it in Mars, which is really interesting. I want to bring something on the table. Every time a parent goes in for a diagnosis and a diagnosis is given and told that the child is autistic or neurodivergent, and I know that people from the science also explain this. They say this is a different kind of wiring of the brain. Of course, the symptoms are also explained. But I've heard from many parents that that is the moment that truly breaks them.
Sure.
They feel devastated. In my mind, I always assumed that breaking was happening because of stigmatization around the idea that there is a different wiring of the brain. What do you think?
I think that people don't take easily to change irrespective. We all like predictability. We all like expected outcomes. And the expectation is that if I have a child, then the child will grow up the same way I grew up, or I will be able to raise the child in a manner that most people I know have raised their children. And they will go to school and college and work and get married and, have their own lives. And my responsibility will come down a large extent after a certain age, right? But the reason why it possibly hits them is because they are neurotypical and they are not able to relate to the fact that they do not, at that moment and that moment of truth, they're not able to process how their life is going to be, how their child, the dream that they dreamt has been pretty much shattered. And it takes time for them to dream again. That is the, I think, the crux of this whole thing. Is there a stigma around it? Yes, there is. Everyone wants to fit in. Everyone wants to be accepted. We try to be, while we want to be unique and quirky in our own way, we all want to fit in. Yeah. So to be able to fit in, you will try to find commonality. And if you don't find that commonality with another individual or with society at large, then there's a lot of fear. There's grief, there's fear, there's a whole bunch of emotions. And stigma is one of them. I don't think it's stigma alone.
Okay, if we have to say that is, but we also have a parallel conversation going on about how embracing differences is going to have to be the need of the hour.
Sure.
How do we support parents, nurturers to be open to these ideas while helping them also understand that it is possible?
It takes time, Akshay.
Absolutely. Look, I'm coming from my space of lived experiences. You were aware that I'm neurodivergent, and I think one of the things that really supported my mother in this journey was to not pay too much attention to the fact that there was a different wiring there, and to treat me just like any other child, to also function like just any other mother. While I'm probably putting this very simply, to be able to disassociate with an idea that is making you feel broken sometimes can just be the simple answer, don't you think?
It could be, but depends on the level of neurodivergence, right? It's also not just like, okay, suppose my child was not able to speak, not able to, or didn't know how to speak, right? That might be a larger conversation or a larger point of stigma, fear, grief than the child who's able to just speak. The difference is there. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think you're pointing to the spectrum disorder now.
Correct.
You're talking about the mild, moderate, and the severe boxes where it can be anywhere. Do you want to expand on that?
So when we were studying, we were allowed to, because it's a spectrum disorder and for better understanding, to establish baselines. There were cohorts like mild, moderate, severe. I do not know if they exist anymore. But basically on levels of impairment, a person who is severely impaired will have certain more difficulties than a person who is moderately or mildly impaired in the neurotypical world. Yeah. That because of the support services that are required for a mildly autistic person is fewer than a person who is severely autistic or has other comorbidities as well. It's just the way it is.
So while we are addressing this, the spectrum disorder,
Right.
and we, I think, have brought in the definition of autism, we have also spoken about the stigma that is around this word.
Sure.
I genuinely feel, and also I believe, that despite the barriers, when we are able to create the right kind of environments, when we are able to put in place the systems, whether educational or frameworks that could support a child to understand what social emotional conditioning can feel like, can be like, communication systems, and today with technology there are many options, as you know. I feel that isn't the task of the nurturer to support the child to achieve their potential, whatever it may be. Now, whether in the spectrum disorder, a child who is in the severe end can reach a certain potential, and to have the faith and to understand this idea that there is a potential.
Correct.
Even in the neurotypical world, the potential is not the same for everybody.
Correct.
It varies.
Correct.
Similarly, in the spectrum disorder also, the potential is bound to vary.
Sure.
But as nurturers, is it not wiser to support that individual to achieve that potential, as opposed to focusing again on the deficits and the limitations of those deficits?
It is important that they do it. I think they'll be happier parents. Child is also happier. It comes from, you need to bite the bullet and build that resilience in your child, irrespective. Yeah. We do not function in a neurodivergent world. We function in a neurotypical world where the majority is neurotypical. And I don't think, if that changes, okay, until then, it's important for us to, while you embrace the autism and all that you bring with it, I think it's also important to understand the magic of autism as well.
Yes.
Yes. We focus on the strengths, focus on their attention to detail, focus on, the way, a sense kaleidoscope artist sits for hours and hours and hours. I think one of your students sat for about 250 hours at a piece. Yeah, I don't think I can sit for 5 hours at a piece. Forget 5, maybe 2. I can try, and my exposure to art has been that adult coloring book, which I'm just like, when is this page going to end? But yeah, I think building resilience and celebrating the magic of autism is something that could help nurturers give them hope, hope to smile, and celebrate their lives as much as they can celebrate their child's life.
Well, thank you so much. I think the last words, the way you kind of brought it all together, was very close to my heart. So thank you very much for that.
And thank you, all the listeners and viewers, and see you in our next episode.